Morning, everyone. My name is Pam Derkatch, and I'm Manitoba Crop Alliance's Chief Executive Officer. And I welcome everybody today, both our delegates and our staff, as well as our guests and presenters to today's panel discussion. Just a few housekeeping things. Please mute your line if you haven't already done so. Please make sure that your name is presented on the screen. So if you could go in and rename yourself, if your name's not appearing, that would be fantastic. If you have a question you'd like to ask, either type it into the chat function or raise your hand or use that raise your hand function. And as well, if we happen to not get to all of the questions during the actual 1 hour panel discussion, we'll make sure to get them all answered afterwards. And we'll send out all those responses to all the participants as well. So just a little bit of a background, and most of our delegates are aware of this. So our board of directors identified a need to have a presentation, and with the goal to provide kind of a high level overview of public and private variety licensing options, as well as kind of royalty collection and distribution mechanisms in Canada. So of course, as we're funders of a diversity of crops, both with public and private institutions, we were definitely interested in having panelists come and join us, both from a public and a private, to bring public and private perspectives to us. So what I'm going to do right now is actually I'm going to introduce our moderator. So we have a moderator for today's presentations. Dr. Patty Rothenberger, she will be our moderator for today, and she will work with the panelists to go through their presentations, moderate the discussion, ask questions, those types of things. So I'll be handing duties over to her in just a short bit. But first I want to introduce her. Dr. Patty Rothenberger is the director of the agriculture branch for Manitoba Agriculture, and she has 22 years of work and educational experience in the agricultural industry. She has served as an advisor and government representative on the Manitoba Seed Growers Association, the Canadian Seed Grower Board of Directors, co-chair of the Canadian Seed Grower Annual General Meeting Planning Committee, chair of the Manitoba Crop Evaluation Team, whereas actually I did meet her for the first time, and we have many stories of fun on those big vet summer tours. She's also been the director of Bioscience Association of Manitoba, a member of the research committee for Western Greens Research Foundation, and she's also on a number of federal, provincial, territorial working groups, roundtables, and agricultural committees as well. So at this point, I welcome Patty, and I'll hand over duties to her to get the panel discussion underway. So off you go, Patty. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Pam, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone this morning. I'm happy to be here with you today and have the ability to moderate our panel discussion on Variety Licensing 101, I think is how we've termed the presentation today. I've had the opportunity to work with our three panelists, Curtis Pozniak, Stephen Capelle, and Brent Derkatch, who will be our experts and speakers who will be participating in the discussion today, to describe really the path of variety licensing here in Canada, and in particular focused in Western Canada. They'll offer a public and private perspective on this topic. So please note that variety licensing is it is a broad topic, and it does have many complex components that could very well warrant a in-depth discussion, probably for an hour each one. And so we'll keep it high level, as Pam mentioned. And the speakers are going to be focusing on their areas of expertise and focusing on their particular crops. So each speaker will speak for 13 to 15 minutes today, and then we'll if there's time warranted, I'll ask one question to the panelist. We'll hold all audience questions until all three speakers have spoken. So the order of our presenters today will be Curtis, Stephen, and Brent. And just prior to each one, I'll give a brief introduction to them. So without further ado, I'm going to start, and Curtis will be our first presenter, as mentioned. So Dr. Curtis Pozniak is a wheat breeder and the director of the University of Saskatchewan's Crop Development Center. He has over 20 years of experience in wheat variety development and has released 17 wheat varieties since 2004. He has served as the chair of the Prairie Grain Recommending Committee for wheat, rye, and triticale for 4 years, and is currently a member of the Seed Regulatory Modernization Working Group. He is an active scientist and has published over 190 peer-reviewed manuscripts. Curtis's passion started in agriculture as a young farm boy growing up in eastern Saskatchewan, where him and his family still run a large grain farming operation. So Curtis, I'll turn it over to you as our first panelist.
All right, thanks, Patty. Just to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yeah.
It's all good? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, all good.
All right, well, yeah, thanks for that kind introduction. And I'm excited to chat with you a little bit today at a very high level about variety licensing in Canada, specifically how we do things at the Crop Development Center. And really it all starts with plant breeding, right? So I'm a wheat breeder at the Crop Development Center. On the left, you can see a video of my plant breeding program. On the right, some disease nurseries. And, you know, it takes around 6 or 7 years to develop a new wheat variety. And at the end of that process, we then move into the variety registration process. And depending on crop kind, that can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. In the case of wheat, it's a 3-year system. So variety registration in Canada is actually regulated through the Seeds Act. And it's clear in that act that no person shall sell or advertise seed for sale in Canada or import into Canada seed of a variety that's not registered. So variety registration is an important part of our process. And the regulation, actually, variety registration is managed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency through the Variety Registration Office. So when we look at crop types that require registration in Canada, we actually follow Schedule 3 of the Act. There's 3 parts to Schedule 3, where our crops fit into. Part 1 requires registration testing. So there's field testing prior to registration to assess for merit. And we'll get into a little bit of discussion of what we mean by merit. And most of the crop kinds actually that we grow in Western Canada fall under Part 1. Part 2, there's still a requirement for pre-registration testing, but it's not a merit-based assessment. And for example, safflower would fall under Part 2, just as an example. For Part 1 and Part 2 crops, in order to proceed with variety registration, there has to be a recommendation from an expert committee. We call these recommending committees that review the merit assessments and manage the pre-registration testing. Some varieties fall under Part 3, which is simply a basic registration requirement. So information that's provided to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to allow registration. So there is no pre-registration testing or merit assessment. In some cases, there are exemptions actually for some crop kinds where there is no registration requirement. So there's an exemption in the Act for certain crop kinds that might be based on production and marketing realities. And I give some examples of corn, food grade soybean, chickpea is another example where there is no registration requirement. So variety registration for Part 1 and Part 2 crops, again, requires the recommendation from a recommending committee. So for Part 1 crops, the real difference is that the assessment is based on merit. And the recommending committee is who actually defines what merit means. And if you go into the Act, merit means that new varieties that we register must either be equal to or superior to check varieties with regard to specific characteristics. So that's how we define merit. Sometimes it's equal to a set of check varieties, or sometimes it has to be superior in performance. And obviously the variety should be beneficial for a particular purpose and in a particular region in Canada. Now for Part 1 and Part 2 crops, the recommending committee defines the testing protocol. So there is a regulatory requirement for Part 1 and Part 2 crops that the recommending committee establish and apply appropriate testing protocols as part of their assessment process. So they define how we test for yield, for example, how we test for disease resistance or end-use quality. And these protocols ultimately have to be approved and vetted by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So the committee I'm most familiar with is the Prairie Recommending Committee for Wheat, Rye, and Triticale, and this is just sort of an organizational structure of how that group operates. The PRC-WRT is actually divided into 3 evaluation teams to assess merit. The first is the agronomy evaluation team, which looks at things like yield and plant height, resistance to lodging. We have a subcommittee that focuses specifically on diseases and evaluates merit of new varieties of wheat for disease resistance, as well as a quality evaluation team, which evaluates the end-use quality properties from a merit perspective. This particular committee represents a very nice cross-sectoral mix of government, academia, and industry. So on the agronomy evaluation team, we have breeders, agronomists, sales reps, and producers, which are an important part of that evaluation team. So the testing protocols that we use, again, at a very high level, in the case of wheat, is we do 3 years of testing. We do 2 years of testing actually for 1 wheat class, the special purpose class. But for the main classes, 3 years of testing is required. And really what we're assessing is the stability of performance relative to check cultivars, and really assessing genotype by environment interactions, how those varieties perform across a range of environments. We have a common set of check cultivars that we use to assess merit. And often, sometimes we'll look at our checks and we'll ask, should we be changing checks? Should we make them more relevant? But at the same time, we also want to make sure that our checks for which we're basing our merit assessment are consistent from year to year. The trial sites that we use are part of our operating procedures, and we try to select those to represent the agroecological zones where the varieties will be grown. Now, there's always this balance between how many testing sites we should be using in order to predict performance, but we try to balance that with cost. Yield testing across a range of environments can get costly, so we try to select sites that are very predictive of performance. Now, when we're assessing merit, we use small plots. You can see some examples of my Durham wheat trials on the right part of your screen. We replicate these trials to get the best data that we can get. And we try very much in these trials to mimic what's happening on farms. So we use commercial seeding rates, we perform weed control, fertilizer application, for example, to maximize yield performance. And really what we're trying to do is assess the genetic potential of a variety. So give the variety what it needs in order to perform to its maximum potential. We don't use fungicides in our trial because one of the things that we do want to assess is reaction to diseases. And so from time to time, we do get disease in our nurseries, like leaf spots, for example, and it gives us the opportunity to assess performance of those varieties in the presence of those diseases. When we're assessing merit for diseases, in case of wheat, we have 5 priority 1 diseases. You can see those on your screen. And when we're assessing merit, we use relevant checks that are specific for each of these diseases so that we can assess them and classify them, in fact, into either a resistant reaction or a susceptible reaction or anywhere in between. So it's important when we're assessing merit that we use the appropriate checks for diseases so that we can accurately assess the disease response. As part of our variety registration system, and while this is true for wheat, it's also the case for a number of other crops, there is a linkage between crop variety registration and the quality, grain quality assurance system. So for example, in wheat, we do assess for merit and use quality for each of the wheat classes, which is an important part of our quality assurance system. So in a way, the variety registration is the underlying foundation of the Canadian grain quality assurance system. I think it gives us a competitive advantage. And the system really that's put in place helps focus us on delivering varieties that have the end use qualities that are demanded by domestic and international grain buyers. So each year, the Prairie Grain Development Committee has a meeting in February where we meet to assess candidate varieties for registration. The three evaluation teams meet. They assess a range of characteristics over the 3 years of testing. And if the variety has merit, for example, for yield, maturity, for disease resistance or end use quality, there's an automatic endorsement and a recommendation for variety registration. If over the 3 years there's maybe a flag, let's say for disease resistance, just as one example, where a variety doesn't meet the minimum requirement for leaf rust resistance, let's say. So that variety is actually flagged for discussion, where a cultivar voting panel, a group of peers comes together, assesses the collective merit of the variety, and decides if a recommendation should in fact be made for variety registration. So it's a very important meeting. On the PRC-WRT, there are about 100 odd voting members that take part in discussions around recommending varieties for registration. So of course, once we get a recommendation for variety registration, we then have to work with CFIA to actually register the variety. And there's a number of things we need to provide to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So there has to be an acceptable name. We have to provide the breeding history, and most importantly, a description of the variety. And when we're describing the variety, we collect a range of traits using a set of test guidelines. Most of these traits are morphological, and there's some examples on the right where, for example, we'll characterize a variety for anthocyanin production in the seedling, or in the bottom picture, characteristics of the seed and gloom of the wheat plant. And these are important to really describe the variety, to make sure it's distinct and that it's stable. And then we also have to provide a reference sample to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency for the variety that we're registering. So once we go through all the process, commercialization is the next step. We start thinking about commercialization in the last year of trialing in registration trials. And really there's multiple paths actually at the Crop Development Center for commercialization. So one path we can take is what we call the right of first refusal, where we develop a variety and a seed partner or a funder what would be granted an upfront right to commercialize that variety. And that's usually because we have some stakeholders that fund our breeding programs upfront. And as part of that arrangement, we agree to provide them a certain number of varieties that are predefined ahead of time as part of our research agreement. If varieties fall out of the right of first refusal process, we go to a variety tendering process. It's a competitive bid process where proposals are put forward. And I know Stephen will give some examples of what proposals look like at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. They're very similar here at the Crop Development Center. There's a peer review process at the university where all the proposals come in. They're peer reviewed. And we also include many of our major stakeholders and funders as part of our decision-making process. In some cases, we do not receive a proposal for a commercialization. And because we're a public institution, we do try to still release those varieties as a public release, where we have a direct relationship between the Crop Development Center and a seed grower who would be interested in releasing those varieties. In most cases, however, we do get tenders for our varieties, and we assess those proposals based on an upfront payment by a company, the market penetration potential for that variety. And we also assess the history of working with the licensee and their portfolio of varieties to make sure that the variety fits into to their portfolio so that we can maximize market penetration. Whether we go the right of first refusal path or the commercial release path, ultimately we move to a variety licensing agreement. And those variety license agreements define how we work together as a university and a seed company. In those agreements, the university retains ownership of the variety, and the university also protects that variety through plant breeders' rights, or if we move the variety outside of Canada to the US, for example, we'll apply appropriate intellectual property rights in those jurisdictions. Most of the time, the varieties that we release are restricted to Western Canada for a small period. And that's largely because most of our stakeholders that are investing in our breeding program are right here in Western Canada. And we want to make sure that for at least a short period, that Western Canadian farmers take full advantage of the new variety. But we do international releases after a period of time, and those releases are defined as part of the variety license agreement, usually 2 to 3 years after release in Canada. As well, the variety licensing agreement defines the royalty sharing model that we have with our seed partners. So this is just sort of a quick overview of how we go through variety registration, what our commercialization strategy looks like at the CDC, and I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis, for that high level yet comprehensive overview on the first step in our path forward to variety licensing. I think you've outlined a critical step as part of that variety registration, and dependent on the crop types that people are interested in, it may vary slightly, but hopefully you'll have an understanding of that key step that variety registration plays within variety licensing. So due to time, we're going to move on quickly to Stephen Capelle, who will be our second speaker. His presentation is going to focus more on one aspect of variety licensing that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada utilizes to release their varieties. And so Stephen has started with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada back in 2004 as a cereal quality technician, and he's transitioned into his current role as a commercialization officer with the Office of Intellectual Property and Commercialization back in 2010. He has responsibilities for coordinating Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's crop variety release process during most of his recent time with Ag Canada. Stephen was born and raised in Winnipeg. He's been married for 10 years and has 2 sons, ages 4 and 6. And when he's not at work, he enjoys spending time and his summer holidays at a family cabin at Victoria Beach. Stephen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Patty. And I'll just get see if I can share my screen properly here. Can everybody see that okay? Great. Okay, well, thank you very much. And yeah, I don't often get a chance to present about this topic outside of people in my own department. So thanks for the opportunity to do this today. So I am going to focus on our request for proposals process. So that last slide that Curtis talked about, I'll do a deeper dive on what we do at Ag Canada for releasing our varieties. So I thought maybe as a first slide, just sort of describing why we license our varieties. Why don't we sort of choose other paths? And sometimes I get asked the questions why we don't just sell the ownership of our varieties to companies, or if anybody can buy our new crop varieties. And so we have 35 breeding programs at Ag Canada across 20 research and development centers. And as the federal government, we don't really have the capacity to commercialize those varieties ourselves. We're not in the seed business, and nor does I think anybody want us to be. So we have a mandate to retain ownership of our intellectual property. So we always need to keep ownership. We can't sell our varieties to private companies so we always choose licensing as the way to commercialize our varieties. So we rely on industry partners to market and distribute the pedigreed seed of our varieties in the marketplace. So this we have a germplasm policy. No surprise that the government would have a long policy for everything. So the reason why I wanted to bring this up is that our field crop germplasm policy really kind of anchors our licensing strategy. It talks about these 3 points in particular, about giving access to the best varieties, offering them at competitive prices, and giving the Canadian industry a competitive advantage. So we participate in a lot of different crop types and sort of classes of those crops. And our licensing strategy wants to make sure that those are all made available to across the country equally, and that we sort of don't have any monopoly situations. We want to foster competition. And as the Crop Development Center does as well, we want to make sure that our varieties are offered to Canadian farmers first. So we do have a default position in our license agreements to have a minimum of 3 years of Canadian seed sales before we consider expansions of the licensed territories in our license. So the request for proposals process is what we use to release the majority of our crop types, including wheat, oats, barley, beans, soybeans, peas, and forages. So like this Crop Development Center is first right of refusal. We do have some varieties that are encumbered to the institutions that funded their development. So an example might be the Prairie Oat Growers Association heavily funds our Brandon oat breeding program. And so they would get some options from some of the varieties out of that program. So those varieties don't go into the RFP, and we would license those varieties directly to either the institution that funded them, or if the institution that funded them doesn't have the capacity, just like Ag Canada doesn't have the capacity to commercialize those varieties themselves, they could assign the licensing rights to one of their members to commercialize that variety. And while the request for proposals process that I manage handles the vast majority of the new varieties that come out of our breeding programs, we do have some crop types that don't participate in that program. So that would be like potatoes, corn, canola, fruit. And so those ones don't necessarily show up in the crop variety request for proposals process. Okay, so why a request for proposals? So we probably release about 20 to 30 new varieties every year in the programs that feed into the request for proposals process. So we need to find commercial partners for those unencumbered varieties. And as the federal government, we have a responsibility to be fair and transparent. So we need a process that that's available to everyone, that anyone can submit a proposal, where the guidelines are clear and published. And so the request for proposals model really works well for that, where we can have a website and sort of everybody gets the same information, uses the same form and provides the same information to us in their proposal. It also encourages small and medium-sized enterprises to participate as well. So it's not just sort of only for the big companies that can submit proposals. Anyone is welcome to submit a proposal for our varieties. So the target audience for our request for proposals process would be seed companies, pedigreed seed companies mainly. So and in Canada, we really only have a handful of major pedigreed seed companies, and that's majority of who submits a proposal in our process. But we also do sometimes receive proposals from smaller entities, such as individual pedigreed seed farmers. I know one year we had a sandfoin variety that apparently was really good for honey. And so I had a guy who ran an apiary that was worried that no one was going to pick up this forage variety and was prepared to submit a proposal himself to grow it even on his own land, just to have this variety sort of available for his bees. So it's we do sometimes see proposals from small companies, and we have licensed to very small entities over the years. So, but primarily large pedigreed seed companies. So the timeline of the RFP, we've just come off of the RFP season. So just a couple of weeks ago, we announced the results, which third bullet there is usually in mid-April. So we were a little bit early this year, which was kind of nice. Although this year we didn't really need to be that early. Sometimes people are banging down our door to get the seed in their hands. But this year with the snow we've had, it's not as urgent as it has been in some years. So Curtis did a really great job of describing the registration recommending meetings that happen in February, although now they're starting to creep into early March. So that again pushes back our timeline a bit, because the only varieties that we offer for licensing are varieties that have been recommended for registration. So we really can't get going on this process until we know that list of what's been recommended at those recommending meetings. Now I deal with a national sort of variety release. So there's recommending meetings that happen in the East, and they happen earlier in February, I think even some in late January. But the one I have to wait for is the Western one, the Prairie Grain Recommending Committee, that does happen later in February, earlier in March. And so our request for proposals process officially opens the first Wednesday after that meeting, and after we have the full list of AFC varieties that were recommended for registration. And our process stays open for 3 weeks. There's a website, so on that first day, all the new varieties get posted with descriptions, and our website has everything they need. It has a proposal submission form that's a standardized form. It has a sample of our variety license, so our 40-page license template is available for companies to look at what they'd be signing if they're successful in their proposal. So the week after the RFP closes, we review the proposals that we've received, and similar to the Crop Development Center, we have a committee that assesses those proposals, and we always make sure to include at least one non-AFC member on that committee to give us some objectivity and perspective on the proposals we've received. And then the results are announced in mid-April, and immediately after that, we get to work on either negotiating a license, or sometimes if the license negotiation is going to take longer and we want to release the seed sooner, we will engage in some kind of other smaller, shorter agreement that we can do more quickly before we get to a license, like a material transfer agreement or a letter of intent that just gives us something with the company so that we can release the breeder seed that we have to them, so that we can get going on increasing that before the season starts. So I just included there also a sole variety license. We don't do exclusive licenses. It's just because this is about licensing, it's sort of worth noting that the kind of license that we negotiate with these companies is a sole license, and that really gives us freedom to operate. We can still do research with the variety. We can still breed with the variety. We're not giving away exclusive rights to the company where we don't retain that freedom to operate. So just sort of to understand that distinction of a sole license versus an exclusive license is important, just to sort of realize that we are retaining rights to work with a variety going forward for research and development purposes. And there are times that we would do a non-exclusive license with companies. If we have an older variety maybe that's been out in the marketplace already, that's been returned, we would probably do a non-exclusive license where anybody who came to us asking for a license for that particular variety would be offered the chance to market it. Obviously, that's not ideal for a company if they want to have, you know, sort of more exclusivity with the variety. But there are cases where maybe it's a minor crop type or a minor class, and someone is just happy to have a license at all, and there's not going to be, you know, significant acreage necessarily or heavy competition. And so a non-exclusive license is a way that we sometimes can handle that situation. So I mentioned the proposal submission form briefly. So it's a standardized form that everybody fills in the same information, and it conforms to our evaluation criteria, which we also publish on the website. So it's very clear to everyone what we're evaluating when we evaluate our proposals, and the proposal submission form that they use to submit their proposal really elicits all that information that's in the evaluation criteria. And we sort of insist that people submit separate proposals for each variety. So we don't sort of accept a sort of, I'll take any wheat that you have, or sort of here's a proposal for everything. You know, we really do want them to submit a proposal that speaks specifically to the variety that they're interested in. And so here's the evaluation criteria that we use, and this is published on our website, so everybody kind of knows what they're aiming for, and it has the weightings of that. So company profile kind of, you know, gives us a sense of their experience in marketing the same crop type, and you know, that they know what they're doing. Financial offer is pretty cut and dry, sort of an upfront fee and then an ongoing royalty, either as a percentage or dollars per ton. Marketing and production strategy is really the sort of one that has the most meat on it, I guess. It's got sort of how it's going to be advertised, how they're going to increase the seed, how they're going to, what their protection plan is, whether they'll use a winter nursery. So all those kind of things are evaluated in marketing and production strategy. And then the investment section, 20% is just a way to partially give credit to companies that do invest in our research, and does have some categories for everybody to say something about sort of whether they'll, you know, pay for the entry fees of provincial variety trials or use demonstration sites. So there's just way that people, that companies that are submitting proposals can demonstrate an investment in the variety. So here's a screenshot of our website. So you can see you got the sample variety license agreement, the results from this year, the proposal submission form. So this website is not password protected, or it's a public website, so anybody can visit it and take a look at all our guidelines and the varieties that are on offer. And as I said, this website sort of goes live every year, the first Wednesday after that Prairie Grain recommending meeting. So, and then some final points. So varieties that are not picked up in their first year are offered again for a second and final time. So we do have, you know, 20 to 30 varieties that go into the RFP every year, and certainly not all of those would get proposals. And so they are offered a second time the following year. And if they're not picked up after that second year, then they are kind of shelved. It's not to say that they wouldn't be available. They might be available for non-exclusive licensing, but often if they aren't picked up in their second year, then that sometimes means that there's something about them that is just not right for the industry, or that we're getting a signal that maybe there's you know, it's something not quite right with that variety. So if the C and the company cannot successfully negotiate and sign the license before February 1st the following year, the variety may be offered to the second choice proponent or be reoffered in the RFP. So I don't think we've ever had a case where we didn't negotiate the license within a year, but we do reserve that right where we you know, would offer it to the second choice company, or if it was the only proposal, we would just re-enter it in the RFP the next year. And licenses typically have a term of 20 years, and that's kind of broken up into an initial 10-year term and then 2 5-year renewals, just to kind of give us some check-in points throughout the 20-year term. And that 20 years is equal to the life of plant breeders' rights. And that's often why we do it that way. And then one other point I sort of thought about was the naming of varieties. And I'm sure everybody seen our varieties in the market, sort of AAC, this and that. And so how we come up with the names, I guess it was 20, 30 years ago, we had the AC and then we trademarked AC. So it was AC trademark, sort of a certain name. And then the trademark thing didn't work out very well. So we went to the AAC name, which is bilingual, I guess. And so in terms of naming the varieties, we really try to leave it up to the companies that have submitted the proposal. The breeder and the companies usually sort of come to an agreement about the name, but we recognize that that is, often a marketing decision. And so we do leave that naming up to the companies as much as possible to allow them to give it a name that they're going to market and do the best with. So and that's all for me. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. You were pretty much right on the 15-minute mark. So we'll proceed into our third and final speaker for today. And so, as mentioned earlier, Curtis has done a great job of describing kind of that variety registration process, what the steps are in order to get a recommended variety, in order to entertain one component that Stephen's described, the request for proposals as part of the variety licensing journey. Brent is going to take a slightly different approach as a private sector member and discuss a couple different facets in his presentation. So one, he'll touch on as a seed distributing company, how they participate in the RFP process and some considerations as part of the process. He'll also touch on how they perhaps do things a little bit differently through variety licensing through the private company perspective. So just Brent, as you're getting ready to queue up your slides, I'll just do a brief introduction. So Brent, for those of you who aren't familiar with him, joined Canterra Seeds in 2001, and he's currently the director of the Pedigreed Seed Business Unit with Canterra Seeds. His responsibilities include activities related to a broad seed portfolio of cereals, pulses, and special crops. His primary focus is on demand creation through various variety-specific market development efforts with grain handlers and end users across Canada and abroad. Prior to joining Canterra Seeds, Brent spent 3 years with Brett Young Seeds in the turf seed production and sales role. Brent is also an active volunteer in the seed industry for many years, including president of both the Canadian Seed Trade Association and the Canadian Plant Technology Agency. He has participated in many industry committees, including the Plant Breeders' Rights Advisory Committee and Seeds Canada Facilitated Variety Use Agreement Subcommittee. In addition, Brent has recently joined the Board of Agriculture in the Classroom for Manitoba. Brent's graduated from Olds College Seed and Grain Technology program and holds a certificate in management from the University of Manitoba. Brent grew up on a mixed grain farm, family farm near Russell, Manitoba. So I'll turn it over to you, Brent, to take us through the last part of the journey for variety licensing.
Great, thank you, Patty. Can you hear me okay and see my slides? Okay, great, and good morning, everybody, and thanks to the Manitoba Crop Alliance staff and delegates for the opportunity to provide a seed distributor perspective. I've been involved directly or indirectly in variety licensing and variety tenders and variety acquisition for about 20 years. And so I'll attempt to share some of the items that Patty mentioned in my introduction. So thank you as well, Patty. Just real very quickly, Canterra Seeds, we've last year celebrated our 25th anniversary. We're a seed production distribution company primarily owned by farmers. We have approximately 170 pedigreed seed growers that are situated across the grain growing areas of Western Canada. And they are the partners that we utilize in our seed production and commercialization efforts for our various field crops. We also invest in some private variety development in partnership with Lima Grain Cereals Research Canada out of Saskatoon. And so we have a combination of varieties that are in our portfolio from both public sector, private sector, as well as that direct joint venture cereals breeding company that's based out of Saskatoon. So the variety acquisition process, as was noted earlier, it's really timely that we're talking about this now because we have just come off of the heels of it. And I would suggest that as a distributor, this process is ongoing and really starts, years in advance of even the variety being available to acquire. And I use the term scout and draft process. We're kind of looking at varieties in the registration trials even before they are proposed and recommended or supported for registration. And it allows us to create our own short list and wish list of what we might be looking for when they do become available to tender or to license. And for us, our motivation is to have that ongoing diversified portfolio. We operate with numerous varieties and in multiple crop types. And so we're always looking for the needs of the market. We operate, and as do many companies, with ingredient type varieties versus broad-based commodity varieties, and in a lot of cases in certain crop segments like milling, oats, and malting barley varieties where there are preferred variety lists. So we're trying to fill these various market needs, and ultimately, and it has been noted earlier in the merit-based variety registration system, we're looking for new and improved varieties, something that adds incremental value to the value chain. Not just to the seed grower and farmer, but beyond that, thinking a little bit deeper than that. And of course, the check varieties are also what we are measuring against, but we're also trying to do direct or indirect comparisons against relevant competitor products or commercially relevant varieties. The largest market share varieties in various crop types and segments may or may not be the official check varieties. So one of the challenges is for us to do comparisons to predict as best we can what those products are going to do in the field. When it comes to the analysis part of the acquisition process or the RFP process, as Canterra Seeds, we've refined our process over the last 20 years or so, and we use a 5 to 8 year modeling or forecast model through Excel spreadsheets and so on. And what we're ultimately trying to do is assess anticipated product performance by estimating what market share those products may have by province, what the seed production volumes would need to be, what's the % certified seed use, because that varies by crop segment as well too. And ultimately it's a formula to figure out seed sales, and ultimately as well the royalties that need to be generated off of those sales. We also are looking at various cost assumptions related to variety testing through the provincial variety trials as well, the data that shows up in provincial seed guides, intellectual property protection, the marketing and market development costs that are associated with that. And we're ultimately doing a financial analysis through that 5 to 8 year time horizon. And then from there, we're putting together the formal proposal. And I'd like to commend the organizations like the CDC and Ag Canada for really streamlining this and creating more clarity around the breakdown of what is expected and required through the RFP process. That wasn't always the case years ago, and I really have appreciated as a distributor for that degree of structure. Makes it a lot more transparent as well. And of course, I'm not going to repeat all the items that Stephen broke down in detail, but that's the level of detail that we're providing in our proposals. I use the word exclusive, and I appreciate Stephen also clarifying that as the sole rights. When I was thinking exclusive, I was thinking it from a territory perspective rather than from an ownership perspective and whatnot. So although it's an option in some cases, as Stephen mentioned, it's very unusual to have a license right to a variety that would be non-exclusive. So primarily it would be exclusive rights to a seed distribution company to manage within a defined territory. As well, those material transfer agreements, letter of intent, and variety license agreements are all part of the contractual requirements in licensing. And we very much appreciate being part of that variety naming exercise as well as including all the details that were mentioned earlier. When it comes to privately developed varieties, companies like ours and others will be dealing with large, small, local, and international developers. Some are very familiar with the process here in Western Canada, and others less so. And so as a distributor, we may get even more involved in the process of variety testing and variety registration. And in other cases, they have taken it through the entire process, and we are looking to acquire the varieties once they're supported for registration, similar to those from Ag Canada and CDC. As well in the private sector, not surprisingly, there's long-term partnership arrangements where investments have already been made with seed distribution partners in a program, and then they can get that right of first refusal right. In some cases, breeders will select multiple preferred distribution partners, and they may operate a draft system, meaning that one distributor gets first choice 1 year and the other company gets first choice the following year, and so on. There's also the one-offs options available where variety is available and it's more or less shopped around and not necessarily taken through a request for proposals type process. It's a little less formal. And it really depends on the breeding program as well, how they're funded, and that type of detail can influence the process that they take. There's also different motivations from different variety developers. If you think about the malting barley industry, or there's organizations like AB InBev and Miller Coors that have their own breeding programs, and their motivation is really about generating malting barley for their beer. And so their go-to-market strategy on variety licensing will likely be very different than what a private variety developer may be looking at to get it out, a variety out in a broad-based market acceptance across Western Canada. There also might be varieties that have traits, GM traits and some other crop types and so on. And so there's a lot of factors that come into play that will determine the approach the private developer will take. The list of responsibilities is pretty long. It is in large part included in the list of what is in the proposals. But the foundational component of it is seed production and sales. And again, it does matter somewhat on what that commercialization model is. Is it through a variety-specific identity preserved contracting program, or is it a broad-based variety release? Royalty collection, marketing, promotion, variety naming, and support. That knowledge transfer, all the technical, agronomy, disease, quality information that either a seed grower, a farmer, a grain company, an end user may need to make a decision on whether or not that variety works for them. The seed distribution company, although we don't own the intellectual property rights per se, we are responsible for the monitoring of the market and ultimately any enforcement that might be required in the event that there's a breach of intellectual property protection, i.e. if somebody is brown bagging common seed of a protected variety, we would get involved. There's a lot of market development that occurs. That's often done in conjunction with various associations or committees. Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center being one for malting barley as an example, that we would work collaboratively with to do the demand creation, the variety registration trials, there's demonstration plots, and of course the reports that are due at the end of the year back to the breeding partner. There are some associated risks, as you can appreciate, with going through this. In many cases, there's an upfront financial contribution that's made, and that's based on a bunch of assumptions. It's assumptions on assumptions on assumptions. You're assuming that you know what the acre base will be for that base commodity type, what the market share is going to potentially be, what the certified seed use is going to be. You're assuming that it's going to have end-use market acceptance. Again, those variety-specific or crop segments with preferred varieties, malting barley again being a great example, milling oats another one. And there isn't always complete predictability of product performance. Sometimes varieties perform greater than expected, and in other cases less so. There may also be impacts of the timing of variety release to the market based on adverse weather during seed increase. Last year being a great example. When you have a drought, it can impact your variety release dates, which ultimately affects the time when you can generate revenue with certified seed sales in the market. And then, we're not going to get into all the details of variety reclassification, but that impacts the seed distributors and seed growers as it does others in the marketplace. And of course, ultimately at the end, there's also the competitor of not just our other seed companies with other varieties, but the own use farm safe seed, which is obviously part of the system that we have, but it is not predictable on how much own safe seed may be in place for certain varieties, and that can impact your sales and revenues as well. When bringing varieties to market, it does vary by crop type. I'm primarily thinking about cereals, pulses, and special crops when I'm presenting today, less so about hybrid canola, but I can certainly speak to that later in questions if required. But the visual on the right will give you an idea of if you have a small volume of breeder seed in year one, you have a narrower triangle of seed increase as you get closer to selling certified seed, which is the pedigree of commerce, I would call it. That's the largest volume of seed that's sold to a commercial farmer that generates royalty revenues. And when you have less breeder seed available, it may take even a year longer to get to market, or you'll get to market with smaller volume. Whereas if you start with a larger volume of breeder seed in year one, or maybe even breeder and select seed, if the breeder has taken it upon themselves to do larger increase in anticipation of variety registration, a seed distributor can take on that variety and get to market earlier, and maybe even take off a year before releasing certified seed to the market. Ultimately, our objective as a distributor is to get to market as fast as possible. That does lower the risk to us if we can generate revenues quicker, and that also is of mutual benefit to the breeding partner, where we're trying to generate maximum market potential and sales as quickly as we can. When we do if I touch just quickly on canola, the seed multiplication factor is a lot different, so it will also impact that you can go to market a lot faster. The territory rights, although we are starting obviously within a defined territory within Canada, and the examples that were used, in other cases we can go to the market in the US at the same time, or maybe even in international markets. Particularly, we'll have more flexibility with privately developed varieties in most cases. And really what we're trying to do is right-size that supply and demand. And so in cases where we have end-use market acceptance requirements that are needed before varieties are broadly adapted, we just want to make sure we're increasing seed at the right pace relative to anticipated demand. And there is definitely an art and a science that goes along with this, matched with good planning and some good luck. So that was my presentation, Patty. So back over to you for the Q&A.
Okay, awesome, Brent. Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. It's great to kind of bring the whole presentation together with a seed distributor's perspective on the RFP process and some of your responsibilities and risks that are associated with going through the process, as well as touching on the private variety licensing aspects. So I'm going to start with you, Brent, for the first question, while others are, I don't see any questions right now that haven't been responded to in the chat function here. So I'll start posing some questions, and if anybody does have any, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. Otherwise, I do have a few questions that come to mind for me. So Brent, can you describe what's the most challenging part of going through the RFP proposal process to acquire a new variety? What would you consider some of the most challenging aspects?
Yeah, you know, I think the art and science component of it is really it's the reality, because you're in some ways you're going to a little bit of a blind auction where you can do all the financial modeling that you want and predictive modeling that you want, but then you also have some of the more intangibles of, you know, how important is that particular product to acquire for your portfolio? Is it going to fit a critical need for you? Can you anticipate or not how your competitors might be looking at their portfolio at the same time? And you also have to try to do those cross comparisons against varieties, not just the varieties that came through variety registration at the same time, but the ones also that are, you know, still in seed increase that haven't been commercially released. So there is a high degree of uncertainty and a lot of effort that's required, I would say 12 months a year, in trying to analyze not just our own portfolio, but as I mentioned, that scouting that's required within the material that's in in trials coming forward, but also the ones that have been more recently released. So I tell you, I wish I had a more clear crystal ball than I do, but there is definitely a lot of art to the science involved.
And I imagine a lot of forward looking too, right? Spending time looking at what's coming down the pipeline, because if you hedge your bets and bet on what's in the current system, there may be something coming a year or two down the line. And if you acquire this certain variety, it may take you out of running for future ones too. So just one follow-up question for you, Brent. How do you as a seed distributor company manage your risk when you're acquiring varieties through an RFP process, knowing the variety registration process that Curtis described? As the varieties go through a registration system, they're compared to performance checks for yield, disease, quality, and they may not be representative as to how you think they're going to perform. Is there any guarantees as you go through the system, or what happens if the varieties don't perform as you're expecting?
Yeah, well, certainly there's no guarantees. We try to be as predictive as possible, and I think the other component of that scouting period, scouting comment that I made earlier is we're not just looking at data when we're doing scouting. We're trying to look at the trials themselves. So we have product managers that spend time during the growing season to attempt to get that visual cue to align with the data. But some of the things that we do to manage risk overall is certainly from a seed production risk management perspective, whatever quantities of breeder seed or select seed or both that we get in that first year, there's always that risk management in geographic risk. We also, again, it depends on the product and crop type, but the financial risks can be managed in some cases. And again, it's being that you're going through an RFP process, you don't know what the other competing companies are doing, but it's a combination of upfront financial contribution and then maybe some risk share or mutual success sharing when you meet sales milestones. So maybe you commit to paying larger lump sum royalty payments in addition to standard royalties in order to reward success. Or when a variety gets added to the recommended malting barley variety list, which is sort of the gold standard for acceptance of varieties, maybe there's a milestone that's a financial milestone that's met as part of that exercise. So there's a couple of different ways that we've approached this to share success with the breeders as well.
Okay, awesome. Stephen, I'm going to turn my next couple questions to you. So the first one, you've described, the RFP process, and it is similar to the process that Curtis utilizes at the University of Saskatchewan as well, or the Crop Development Center. Once you've selected the successful company, just having come off this process right now, can you kind of describe what are the immediate next steps that you're anticipating that you're going to be going through in the next several months? Like there is the paperwork component, but can you touch a little bit on as far as the seed distribution and some of the things that you maybe didn't touch on, just to elaborate on the next steps?
Sure. Well, the seed is definitely the most critical one, and time is of the essence at this time of year to get that seed in the hands of the successful company. So we don't always have breeder seed available. There would be some varieties that are offered that there isn't necessarily breeder seed available. So those ones, there's a little less pressure. Then there would be, things like winter wheat where, sort of they're not going to need the seed till the fall. So there's less pressure on that one. But for ones where we do have a significant amount of breeder seed to hand over to the company, at Ag Canada, we want to have that paperwork in place before we release the seed. And sometimes, negotiating that 40-page license agreement is not tenable in time to get that seed handed over in a timely fashion. So we do have a letter of intent agreement that we put in place, or a material transfer agreement that can be put in place a little more quickly. So then that seed that's usually produced at our seed increase unit in Indian Head can be made available to the company, and once we hand off that seed to them, it's really the increase plan is sort of on them to get it in the ground and distribute it to their grower network or figure out how that seed is going to get blown up.
Okay, perfect. One more follow-up question for you. Just as you're looking at licensees for variety distribution, do the regions come into factor as far as if you're looking for Western Canadian national registration, and international. You touched on that there's kind of that waiting period to go international of 3 years to give that competitive advantage. But do companies request, or is the RFP process strictly for Canadian rights initially?
It's pretty much strictly for Canadian rights initially. Companies are welcome to put in their proposal, their interest in international territories or territories outside of Canada. Obviously, the US is the most common one that companies are interested in, and after the 3-year Canadian sales period is up, that's usually where we expand the territory initially. But in terms of sort of the adaptability of the variety to international territories, we leave that on our licensees to really tell us if they have interest in other territories. We don't usually break up our licenses to separate companies for different territories. We really do rely on our Canadian licensees to seek out those opportunities and sub-license or sort of pursue opportunities in other territories. So it's not uncommon for the companies to come back to us after 3 or 5 or 10 years asking to expand the territory to some other sort of international countries that where they see an opportunity to either sub-license or they have maybe some strong connections in that country and want to pursue them.
Okay, no, thank you. Pam, I recognize that we're over time. We've taken an extra 10 minutes to ask a few questions. So I just want to be conscious of everyone's time, and I'll maybe turn it back over to you. But before I do that, just thank you to our panelists. It's been a pleasure working with you to develop your presentations and tell that story that describes our path, our journey that we're on from variety registration through to variety licensing. And I hope it's been informative for all the participants on the call today. And I'll turn it back over to you, Pam, to close the session.
Yeah, and I will close. I have probably 5,000 questions I would love to ask the panelists. They probably all know me and they have some burning questions I'd love to ask, but I know where to find each of them, so I can definitely follow up. But first of all, yeah, I want to thank you, our panelists, Curtis, Stephen, and Brent, and to our moderator today, Patty. The amount of work that these 4 individuals put in today's panel discussion is very much appreciated. I know they had 2 planning meetings held prior to today, as well as the time they took to develop their presentations, and of course, the time they took today to present to us. It is very much appreciated, and I want to thank you very much on behalf of Manitoba Crop Alliance. The information was absolutely fantastic. So thank you once again. It's very much appreciated. So thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and a great rest of their week as well. And as well prep for the next Colorado low that's coming through apparently. But once again, thank you, everyone, and wishing you all a good day.